Hello? Hello? Can you hear me, JP? Tom? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. How's life?
I was actually just answering in the email about Blatzman.
I'm wondering if a speaker sees this and says, "Oh, I'll leave the meeting now." That'll be that'll be problematic.
A speaker?
Yeah, you get that pop-up, right? Like, if you want to leave the meeting, leave now. Right? The meeting is and the speaker leaves. Like,
Unfortunate.
And then we can all go home.
yeah, well, that's true.
Well, you are home, so. What's the feeling? Should we start on time or should we give them some few minutes?
You're the chair.
Yeah, but trying to be as inclusive as possible.
I would hope that by now, Michael, most people have assimilated.
Assimilated to that we start at 12?
To the new regime. To figuring out how to get onto Zoom and getting ready for midday and all.
Okay. All right. So it's a great pleasure today to welcome Tushar, who I think we all know. And he's going to talk about mass shootings and infant health in the United States today. He has said that he's fine with questions and comments throughout. So I guess if you just want to go ahead and say something, you can do that, obviously keeping in mind sort of the Zoom environment. If you also want to use that hand signal, you can do that as well. And I'll try to have an eye on the chat. And then, and then ask you to ask your question or give your comment, whatever you like. An hour and 15. So yeah, without further ado, Tushar, go for it.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Chris, for organizing this. So before I start, let me warn you that my computer crashes from time to time, and if it happens, I'll take a minute or two to log in back. And that's happening because of Zoom. It never happened before. A fair warning, and apologies if it happens. All right, so this project is joint work with Rakesh Banerjee from University of Exeter. And this is pretty much the draft that Isabella shared is pretty much the first draft that we have written. So any comments that you have will be highly useful, helpful. All right, so let me begin by showing you these pictures. These are 10 of the 14 kids who were killed in the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida in 2018. And the reason why I'm showing you these pictures is not because I want to start on a sympathetic note. Perhaps we should, but I want you to think about what you feel when you look at these pictures, the emotions, because the story that I'm going to tell you relies on what you feel when you hear about these kind of incidents and see these kind of pictures. All right, so to motivate the paper a little, let me start by saying that mass shootings have become an unfortunate reality of life in the United States. So depending on the source that you look at, in 2018 there were somewhere between 12 to 323 incidents of mass shootings, which claimed 80 to 387 lives and injured somewhere between 70 to 1,200 people. In 2020, by now there have been, depending on the source, but now there have been around 100 mass shootings already. In the last month, the number of mass shootings in the United States has gone down because of the COVID virus, but it's still pretty high. It's an ugly truth of life in the United States now. And what these mass shootings do is that in addition to the direct damage they do in terms of lives and injuring people, they cause elevated levels of anxiety, stress, grief, fear, terror in people who even hear about such news. And usually what happens is people move on, people recover. So you hear about a mass shooting, hopefully none of your relatives or friends was injured or was a victim of the shooting. You talk about it, you debate about the gun ownership, lax gun ownership laws in the US, but then you forget about it. And then there's another mass shooting, and then you talk about it again for a few days and then forget about it. So that's how the circle goes, but not everyone heals from these incidents, right? I mean, there's no healing from it, there's no coming back if you have lost or if you have a friend or a family member who is injured. But even if you have not been directly affected, but you are constantly exposed to this news of mass shootings happening again and again, it takes a toll on your psyche, right? I mean, stress is something that accumulates, and that at some point can push you past the threshold where it can have drastic impacts on your health and your everyday life and welfare. We also know that if these kind of events, which are stressful in nature, you get exposed to them during critical periods of your life, they can have long-lasting implications. For example, if a mother gets exposed to these news while she's pregnant with a child, then that can have long-lasting impact on the child's health, education, cognition, and later life income and occupation. They also, these incidents or the news of these incidents also increase or also have an implication on the perceived safety of people and consumer confidence, so they can directly affect the economy through that channel. And they can also give people a feeling that such incidents might be repeated in the future, right? So all this to say that, once a mass shooting happens, it has direct effects on the welfare of people, but there are some effects that persist even years after the mass shooting has happened. So what we'll do in this paper is we'll look at a specific population which we think is especially vulnerable, and that is of the pregnant women and their in utero children. And the reason why we do that is because we think that mass shooting incidents or their coverage in media in particular can generate stress, and that stress during pregnancy can be really harmful. There's a big literature on that in epidemiology. Stress during pregnancy can increase the release of placental corticotrophin releasing hormone, and that in turn can reduce the gestational age of the kid and the birth weight of the kid. And we know that gestational age and birth weight are strong predictors of later life health, education, and well-being, so it can have long-term implications. Stress can also compromise the mother's immune, and so that has direct effects on the mother's health and on the child. Stress can also trigger harmful behavioral responses like smoking, and we know now that smoking is one of the worst things you can do to your child while you're pregnant. So that leads to the research question that we'll be asking in this paper. So the broader question that we are trying to figure out or trying to answer is whether the damages due to mass shootings are even larger once you account for the health impact of mass shooting that extend beyond across generations than what we previously thought it to be, right? And the precise question that we'll answer with the analysis in this paper is, do mass shooting incidents in the US affect the health of the infants born in the US? The health measures that we'll use for our study will be birth weight and gestational age. And as I said, they're strong predictors of child mortality and morbidity, later life health, education, and well-being. So they affect the human capital of the individual and therefore affect the economy in a big way. And just to give you a brief preview of results, just in case somebody has to leave earlier, what we find is mass shooting incidents in the county of birth during pregnancy leads to a decrease in the average birth weight of all infants born in the county, a decrease in the average gestational length of infants born in the county, an increase in the percentage of infants born in the low birth weight category. And all these effects are concentrated on the left tail of the distribution. So people or children who were already worse off and had low birth weight, they go further down the distribution. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll show you something on mechanisms, and where we show that it seems to be the case that stress from exposure to media reports is a likely pathway. So if in some way, so media reports or media coverage of these incidents mediate the effect of mass shootings on health. The effects are larger when the incidents receive more media coverage. All right, so where do we contribute? So we think we contribute to multiple strands of literature, but in each of these domains, our contribution is quite marginal. The first one we contribute to is this big literature on the effect of violent events early in life on health and education. So a lot of papers show that violent events during pregnancy or early life can affect your health and education, not only in the short term and in the long term, but also across generations. The only one limitation of this literature is they cannot rule out direct effects. So what I mean by that is it could be the case that the wars or the violent events harm them physically directly, or harm or lead to disruption of the resource infrastructure, which affects them directly. Right? Many people have conjectured that psychological stress due to these violent events could also be a possible pathway, but those are basically just that, conjectures. They have not been able to show that conclusively. Not that we'll be able to pin down the mechanism perfectly in our paper, but we think we'll take a step in that direction. We will also contribute to this growing literature on the economics of mass shootings. Jetta has some work on it, which I think, and he knows the literature much better than I do, but much of the literature tries to figure out the reasons behind mass shootings and what are the consequences of that. By adding the health element to that, we think that we provide a better understanding of, or a wholesome understanding of the implications for mass shootings. And then finally, we'll contribute marginally to this literature which shows that mass media can affect the well-being of the population in multiple ways. It can affect teenage pregnancies, marriage stability, terrorism, economic development, public choice processes. Here too, Jetta has some very good work on the topic, and we think that we add one more element to that discussion. All right, so let me get into the data. The data that we'll be using will be from the National Center of Health Statistics. So they record all US births by county, year, and month of birth, and it's a pain to get that data from them, but thankfully we did. What the data contains is they have average birth weight of the children born by category. So suppose you were born in the category of 3,400 grams to 3,500 grams. So they will tell us how many people were born in that category and what was the average birth weight in that category. They also tell you the gestational length and the percentage of low birth weight births in the county. They also have information on infant mortality rate by county and year of birth. So infant mortality rate is a rate which is calculated annually. So that's why we don't have it by month of birth, it's by year of birth and county. And as I said, that the reason why we are using these indicators is because they're significant predictors of later life mortality and health and education. All right, so there are a few limitations to the birth data, birth and infant mortality death data. One, that it identifies counties with population greater than 100,000. So for the unidentified, for the counties that have a population of less than 100,000, they club them all together. So all those counties within a state will be clubbed together and will be reported as unidentified counties of that state, right? And then when we have birth categories, if there are less than 10 births or deaths in a category, they'll suppress that data. They'll put a 0 instead of that, or not a 0, but crosses against it, so that for privacy reasons, so that we can't track as to who really died or who had a low birth weight. So that's the birth weight data, birth and infant mortality data. The mass shooting incidents, we compile it from a variety of sources. So, and the criteria that we use is we choose those events where the number of victims have been more than greater than or equal to 3. We exclude the perpetrator. So if the perpetrator is shot down by the police or one of the victims, we don't include that number in a calculation of the total number 3. These shootings have to be at the same location, one location, and roughly around the same time. So if somebody is going around shooting people in different locations, we do not include that. But there are not a lot of such incidents, and if we include them, it doesn't change our results. And obviously, we exclude all shootings related to organized crime or gang-related activities. so that's our mass shooting data, how we compile it. And then, finally, as I mentioned before, that we'll be using the media coverage for mass shootings. For that, we'll follow Michael's work on the topic, and we'll get our data on daily television news coverage from Vanderbilt Television Network Archive. In particular, we'll be focusing on this one evening news show, ABC World Tonight News Tonight coverage, which is the most watched among all evening news programs in the US, and it's highly correlated to what the other programs are covering. We also, in the end, will use disaster-related deaths, international disaster-related deaths, to create exogenous variation in the coverage of mass shooting incidents. And for that, our data will come from International Disaster Database. All right.
Sorry to share just a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to one slide?
Mm-hmm.
This News Tonight coverage thing airs at the same time throughout the whole US?
Yes, that is true. Right. So we will not have variation across county for that, and that's why we will show you heterogeneity analysis and not use it as an instrument. Okay. Yeah. All right. So the empirical specification, all our outcomes will be measured, will be averages at the county level, not at the individual level. So Y here is the outcome measured at the county level for each month and year, right? And we think that birth weight or average birth weight in the county for every month and year for children born in every month and year, or the gestational length, depends on the number of fatalities in mass shooting related fatalities in that county in the 9 months prior to that month year, right, during pregnancy. So, and of course, like, to the extent that mass shooting incidents are exogenous, we don't need to do anything about it, but there's quite a bit of literature now which shows that it might not be exogenous. The economic environment could affect the incidence of mass shootings. So to account for that, what we do is we put in a bunch of controls. We have county month fixed effects. So every county can be different from every other county in the United States, and that difference could be differential across months of the year. Similarly, we have month-year fixed effects, so that will account for trends or time effects that are common to the entire United States. Every month-year is different from every other. We have state-year fixed effects, so every state is allowed to have a different level of fatalities and birth outcomes in every year. And then we have county trends, so every county can evolve differently across time. So we think it's a really tight specification, but I'm open to suggestions if you want me to modify something. Our results don't change a lot if we slacken the specification, of course. But we have tried other combinations and we don't see any changes. So effectively, what will be?
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Have you tried with the 9-month window? Have you tried changing that to sort of doing the first trimesters? So you'll sort of ignore the 3 months previous and then do the 6 months. Because I think that's when the gestation is most sensitive, just to things like smoking.
True. Yeah. So what we have done it's not in this presentation, but we have broken it down by trimester. Exactly what you said. We have effects in 2 trimesters. I'm not sure which 2. So I think it's the first and the third trimester, but I can get back to that. But we tried confirming with the epidemiological literature, and they also claim that the 2 trimesters that we find an effect on are the most sensitive trimesters.
Okay, cool.
I think it's the first and the third, if I remember.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, yeah.
Quick query, just for clarification, Tushar, can you explain what fatal CMI is again?
Yeah, so it's the number of mass shooting related fatalities in County C in the 9 months prior to the birth month and year, right? So if you're born in January of 2020, it's the number of fatalities in the 9 months prior to that.
So do you need, okay. I was just thinking about the notation, if you can improve the notation, because it feels as if it's the number of fatalities in that particular month.
Okay,
You know
so you can do minus M can have a further subscript, minus 9. Okay, that's a good point, yeah. All right. So
sorry, is the number of deaths logged, or is just the actual number?
No, it's the actual number, and we didn't feel the need to log it because they were not very high per incident. So basically, if you look at the log function and the linear function towards the origin, they're pretty much the same, right? It basically flattens out towards the end. But we could try a log version as well. it'll give us, yeah, we could try a log version. That's a good idea. Log fatalities. Okay. So one way of understanding this specification is that we'll be comparing births within counties, so average outcomes for births within counties in the same month, but across years. So January months in Los Angeles counties in 2020 are compared with January births in Los Angeles County in 2021. But while doing that, we are also allowing for there to be time fixed effects. So basically over time, 2020 could be different from 2021, and that's accounted for. So if we are all okay with the specification, I'll go on to show you the results. So this is just a scatter plot with a linear fit. And so if the legends are not that clear, the first figure here shows you the correlation between mass shooting on the x-axis and the average birth weight of babies born in the county on the y-axis. And every dot here, every scatter plot here, every point here is a county month-year observation. And what you see is that as mass shooting fatalities increase, the average birth weight in the county decreases. Now we can get rid of the extreme observations around above 40 or above 20, and we get, actually the results get stronger. So this downward slope actually becomes even steeper. Similarly, the second picture here is, okay, so one thing that I should tell you is that we use two different measures of gestational age. So there's something called the LMP gestation age, which is based on a mother's best guess of the last day of her period, last period before pregnancy. And there's quite a bit of literature which shows that there are a lot of problems with that measure. Mothers can, well, there's obviously a recall bias. You might not remember perfectly when your last date of your last period was, but also there could be confusion regarding, so there are cases in which there are pregnancy-related bleeding, which can be confused with periods. So beginning in 2007, so this was the measure that the CDC was using in the United States to calculate gestational age, but beginning in 2007, they started this new measure called the OE gestational age, which is the doctor's best guess of what the gestational age is. And that's based on how big the baby is, what are the symptoms that the mother is displaying. And quite a bit, yes?
You have plenty of zeros, right?
We have plenty of zeros.
What do you have any number in mind?
I would say that on an average, out of the 365 days in a year, mass shootings happen. My guess would be, so I'm not sure, but my guess would be like 30 days or 30 to 40 days every year. So you'll have one or two events almost every month. Some months are worse than the other, and that's why we have the month fixed effect as well.
So in terms of methodology, you will have to deal with the zeros, right?
Yeah. So the good thing is if we have a lot of zeros on both side fatalities, then basically they will not be used for the identification. The identification will come from when they jump from 0 to 1 or 0 to 2, right? So the variation changes. So and to the extent that we have zeros with the fixed effects, we shouldn't have so much of a problem. But did you have something in mind? Like, did you wanted to see a particular way of dealing with it?
There's some models which can handle samples with many zeros.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do that. Okay. So maybe the
zero inflated model or something.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do a modified Poisson for that matter. Yeah. Yeah.
Tushar, just a quick comment. So, given the fact that you have so many zeros, maybe it'll help because you're not using these zeros for identification, right?
Yeah. So it's only when it comes from 0 to something else.
Yeah. So maybe it'll help if in all these graphs, if you plot from a positive number of mass shootings onwards, I think it'll show these things as much more significant because the variance at the 0 is so high that it's not looking that significant, but I think it is.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Positive numbers of mass shooting. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a very good idea. Yeah, we'll do that. All right. So the second figure here is basically the gestational age, OE gestational age. So that's the doctor's best guess. And there too, you find that as mass shootings, fatalities increase, there's a decrease in the gestational age. The third figure here, it's figure C, is the percentage of low birth weight infants. And you see that as fatalities increase, there's a clear increase in the percentage of low birth weight. But the figure is very low birth weight. So that's basically when the birth weight is below 1,500 grams. So that's often the child doesn't survive beyond infancy. And there too, you find that there is an increase in very low birth weight if the number of fatalities during pregnancy increase. So, but these, of course, are just correlation plots, scatter plots, and what I'm showing you here, this is a regression specification that controls for all the fixed effects that we talked about. Yes.
Sorry, just a quick question. Are you using all counties in the US, regardless of whether they had a shooting at some point or not?
Yes, I am using all counties in the US.
So one option, and that's been used a little bit by Brodeur and Yousaf, is they look at successful versus failed mass shootings.
Mm-hmm.
So you could look at those instances that are recorded where in a county somebody tried to commit a mass shooting but didn't, and that they use that as a counterfactual in an additional estimation.
True. So yes, after you mentioned that paper, I went and looked at it, but to be honest, I'm not so convinced with the success versus failure being exogenous, because obviously if you plan to commit a mass shooting and you're not able to, perhaps infrastructure is better in detecting these intentions and dealing with them, right? So, and that infrastructure, if it's better at that, it could also be that the health infrastructure is better in that particular county. So, but we could definitely, go that route, and perhaps a robustness check like that will definitely help the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem you're having is that all the counties that are not treated are obviously differing among unobservables to the ones that are treated. So I think if you can come up with a creative way of finding a counterfactual county to the one that has the mass shooting, then I think you're a big step ahead. Because that's one big concern, right? That there's a selection issue in terms of which counties experience the mass shooting. For example, it's found that more populated counties are more likely to get a shooting because there's more crowds, and because shooters usually want coverage, they go to very crowded places, and so on and so on.
True, that's true. But I mean, so I agree with that. But to the extent that county fixed effect and county month fixed effect takes that into account, so we're making a comparison within counties to some extent, right? And
it does, but one. So let's say the Super Bowl moves around, and one year it's in one place. So I'm taking the Super Bowl as an example, but there's a bunch of events and a bunch of occurrences, like let's say a political rally, or you can come up with a bunch of things that vary. Not only that it's not the same in one county over time, but we can talk about this later.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that'll be really helpful.
Just following up with Michael's point, do you have information on the shooter?
We do have information, yes.
And is it always the case that the shooter is always from the same county where the shooting actually occurs? Because maybe you can use that.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So mostly from the same county.
I don't know how what will be the number, but if it's significant enough, maybe that'll be a good robustness check.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we do not have information on where did the shooter live. Most often, what we have is age, race, whether any mental illness or not, where did he purchase or the gun or the weapons. But I'll look into it. Maybe we have a smaller sample with that, but we can definitely check that. That's a good idea. It can work as a possible instrument. Yeah.
Tushar?
Yeah.
Did you weight the regression by the county population size?
So since what we are doing is we are looking at only populations above 100,000, we haven't, but perhaps we should, and my guess is it'll strengthen the results even more. So yeah, population weights. Yeah, because as Michael said, that most of these events usually happen in crowded counties where fatalities are really common in crowded counties, and the birth weight having a bigger left tail is also common in the crowded counties, so it's possible.
But also because your outcomes are average at the county level.
Yeah, true.
So
true.
the population size matter.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, so the average that we are using for the birth weight categories are given by the CDC, and that's already weighted by the population in that, in bracket. But I agree that perhaps we should weigh our regressions overall.
Yeah, because if it affects your variance covariance metrics.
Yeah, Yeah, it does. I mean, so the estimates won't be affected, but the standard errors will be affected quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I think it'll go in our favor. That's that's a very good point. Yeah.
Tushar, what is the size of the time dimension?
Sorry, say it again, Hunter.
How many years of data?
Okay, so we are using data from 2003 until 2018. And we can go further back, but the mass shooting incidents are not that common. And the way the CDC reports birth outcomes is also very different. They don't have outcomes like birth weight by birth weight categories and gestational age. So you think it's too small? So it's a small t, big N.
No. It's small. It's small t and big N. Yes, but I didn't know it. It was just.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Which period are you covering?
Yeah. All right. Okay. So these are the regression results. The first cut of results. So basically, the first column, it shows you that if the number of fatalities during pregnancy goes up by 1, so one more person dies during pregnancy due to a mass shooting incident, birth weight decreases by 0.16 grams. Right. Compared to the mean, which is like 3,300 grams birth weight, it's not a lot, and I'll come back to what these magnitudes mean, or what the economic significance of these magnitudes are. In column 2, we have the result for LNP gestation. As I told you, this is based on the mother's best guess of a last day of a last period before pregnancy. We don't find anything here, but our preferred measure of gestation is the one in column 3, OE gestation, which is the doctor's guess. And there we find that one extra fatality during pregnancy is associated with a 0.0007 weeks decline in gestation. In column 4, we have the percentage of births in the low birth weight category, and we find that as fatalities increase, the percentage of births in the low birth weight category increase as well. So those are the first set of results. What we do next is basically we take this first column where we have the birth weight impacts, and to the specification we add mass shootings, later in life and before pregnancy, just to see that the results are not sensitive to mass shootings outside the critical window. And what we find is, it's not that clear, but the only one significant here is if there is a mass, or if there are mass shooting incidents in pregnancy. What's really reassuring is if you look at, say months 1 to 9 or 10 to 18 or 9 to 27, which are after birth, they don't have any impact on birth weight, which should be the case, because the birth weight is already determined by that point, and they should not have an effect on birth weight.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, these are mass shootings that occur in the same county, right?
Yes.
So why have you chosen county specifically as the unit of observation when people might be, as Girish says, somebody might travel to another county to do the shooting, but also it could be you might live and work and etc. in other outside of the county. You might regularly, other spillovers.
Yeah, no, there are definitely spillovers, but so let me start by saying that, we think that the maximum impact will be if someone from your county does something in your county, right? Does a mass shooting in your county. But again, even if it happens in New England, people in California will hear about it and be upset about it.
Quite.
So to the extent that there's a national effect of any mass shooting, it's captured in the state and the national fixed effects, right? But you have a good point where you said that, they can go outside their boundaries, and this goes back to Greece's point, and do this in another county. We don't have a lot of such events. There are events like that, but we don't have a lot of it. So one of the robustness checks that we do is we create a 25-kilometer radius around the shooting coordinates, the coordinates of the shooting incident, and use that as our boundaries, except in place of the county boundaries. So we totally give up on the.
Yeah, fair enough. Good. Yeah.
That's quite. Sorry, just real quick. When you talk about media coverage, you talk about national media coverage. So to the extent that a county at the other end of the country is exposed to it, it is only exposed to it if the media covers it, really. Whereas in the county where it happens, they're exposed to it either way. If that happens in my county, it doesn't matter whether ABC talks about it or not. I'll know about it, and I'll likely be treated quite a bit. I'll be treated more if it's on national news coverage as well. Yeah. But to the extent that you get degrees of treatment, and of course the local community is the one that is by far treated the most. But I I'd venture out and say that the Las Vegas shooting or so would have affected people way outside of that county. And that depends on how the media covers it.
Yeah. No,
so I think you could play with that a bit more.
Yeah. And
That's related to my question to Shao. How do you define mass shootings?
Yeah, so the mass shooting incident is that, okay, so they have to be more than 3 victims, and in the county, excluding the perpetrator, they have to be in the same location, so the shooting incidents have to have happened in the same location and roughly around the same time.
But it relates to my Jeth's question, really depends on the scale of the shooting, and the impact is very different, right?
True. So, well, there are 2 ways to think about it. But going back to Michael's point, I think I agree to it to some extent that, if it's happening in your county, you will be exposed to it in some way or the other. But I think for it to have an impact, so if you think of the LA County, for example, right, it's huge, right? And there are shooting incidents every day, right? And most of the time, you don't even get to know about it unless you read about it in the news or you hear the evening news, right? For smaller counties, that might not be the case. For smaller counties, if a mass shooting happens, the traffic might be affected. You might not be able to get to the hospital in time, and that can have a health effect. So to the extent that that happens, we'll claim that our results are reduced form. That could be a possible mechanism. But to the extent that you think that they are not such big players in terms of affecting the average outcome of the county, then psychological stress comes into the picture, and we'll talk more about it.
You mentioned the radius of, say, 50 kilometers, something like that.
Yeah.
It's a good example using a spatial econometrics in this case.
Yeah. So we have done that. We have weighted, so we create a 25-kilometer radius. We weigh where the incidents were or compared to that radius by distance. We change the radius over time as well. We do with 25 kilometers, 50, 100, and all that, and the results kind of go through. So that's the best I have for now. But yeah, so I'll show you the I'll talk about the robustness checks in a while, but let me talk about the magnitudes, because these magnitudes, a 0.16 gram decrease in birth weight compared to an average of 3,300 grams is not a lot. So we try to make sense of what these mean. So one thing so in our data, on average, there are 6.73 fatalities per pregnancy, right? So in the 9 months before birth. And what that means is if you multiply that with the magnitude that we have a 1.10 grams decrease in birth weight for an infant born in the county in that particular month and year, which is not much, which is 0.03% of the mean. But we then went back and compared it with estimates from other papers, and there are papers which find that a 1% decrease in birth weight in Sweden, for example, decreases permanent income by 0.1%. And similarly, there's a paper in Norway where they find 1% decrease in birth weight leads to so they have a similar decrease in permanent income, but in addition, there's a 0.2% decrease in birth weight of the next generation, right? So if you use those estimates from Sweden and Norway, then this implies a 0.0003% in decrease in permanent income and 0.006% decrease in birth weight, which are small. I'm not saying they're big, but they're still meaningful. And one thing to keep in mind is so 0.0003% of your permanent income is still a good amount of money. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is an intent to treat effect. That means our estimates are reflecting an impact on every child born in the county, right? Because they're county level averages. So that means every child in the county suffers or has a decrease of 0.003% decrease in permanent income. So if you aggregate that, then for the county, it's a big shock. It's a big negative impact. So, and just to give you some idea of how they compare with studies elsewhere, so people have looked at the effect of Ramadan fasting on birth weight, on bereavement, if somebody in your family dies during pregnancy, on predicted climate change and maternity leaves, and they all tend to be almost double of the impacts that we find. There's one particular paper that comes very close to the impact that we find, which is the impact of Super Bowl on birth weight in the United States. So the paper looks at how much the excitement of Super Bowl can affect birth outcomes, and they find a similar magnitude in terms of the birth weight.
Tusha, can I have a suggestion of interpreting these results.
Yeah.
Because these results are observed after everything, right? After the child was born.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose there's a mass shooting happen during the pregnancy, then people might respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have different coping behavior, or maybe there's some medical intervention, or maybe even, you know, there could be government intervention through policy, you know, to help people deal with the stress. So all of this mixed together will be reflected in the outcome.
Reduced
form. So the estimate you get is not just the mass shooting effect, but also it mixed with other coping behavior and also other intervention as well. So maybe the true effect, if you just look at the pure shooting effect, it could be bigger without the coping. But here you can't tell.
That's a good point, right? And this reminds me of something that I should have said, that, you know, when we are comparing it with Sweden and Norway, the coping mechanism that you're talking about are much more developed in Sweden and Norway, the mitigation or the adaptation mechanism. In the US, my guess is the impact of a 1 gram decrease in birth weight will be even higher. So so it's first is the reduced form of all the adaptation or mitigation mechanism that comes after the event. But also, I think, you know, this is an underestimate of, you know, the real economic impacts, because the US is much worse.
Just, can I ask 2 quick questions? How much are you worried about people moving because of a mass shooting, and especially the ones that have the economic means to do so? So rich would-be parents might be, well, let's move to Florida. Let's get out of here because it's all too stressful now, and they would then give birth in Florida or somewhere else. And not at the place. That's something you probably can't measure. And I think another aspect is miscarriages. So what if there's that much stress that you'd have a miscarriage? That's not registered anywhere. So what I think you could do is kind of look at the number of births and compare that to counterfactual of the other. Sorry?
3 slides and I'll show you that.
Oh, okay, sorry,
Okay. No, but the first question about migration is kind of important. We can't do much about it. But the good thing is, if a migration happens, if such migration events happen, they will bias estimates downwards. So what you have is, you have a person who's actually treated by the mass shooting during pregnancy moving to a region where there was no mass shooting events. And so you're not convinced with that direction of the migration?
Well, no. So if somebody who's richer, who might have a kid with higher birth weight anyways, is moving, then that person, if that person had stayed, then the average birth weight of kids might have been higher. If income is a proxy for birth weight, for example, then you get a bias that is not helpful to you.
So what we can do is we can't actually pin down like how many people migrated before pregnancy, but what we have is domestic migration figures and international migration figures, and we can put them as controls. At the level of the county, we can put them as controls and see how they move our results. It's not perfect, but
so at least that you probably should discuss it then.
So I'll show you. That's the next slide, actually. So,
sorry, I'll shut up now.
So the robustness checks that we are doing is basically, so first instead of using the fatalities due to mass shootings, we look at the number of victims. So those are injuries due to mass shooting as independent variables, and the results don't change. So let me know if you want me to click to any of these, show you any of these, and I'll show you. The other one is, instead of using all counties where there are identified and unidentified counties in our sample, we use only identified counties, and our results don't change. So we're dropping some counties, but results don't change much. We use, as I mentioned before, instead of using the administrative boundaries of a county, we create a circle with a radius of 25 kilometers and redo our analysis. Nothing changes. Instead of using our own criterion for defining mass shootings, we use the most coveted one, Mother Jones mass shooting tracking data, and the results don't change. And finally, what I was referring to a while ago, we include economic variables, like economic controls like unemployment at the county level in the year, domestic and international migration at the county level annually, and weather controls like temperature and precipitation, because there's a bit of literature that shows that temperature can actually, higher temperatures can lead to higher rates of violence, and all our results go through. Going back to what Simon was pointing out, or Michael, you were also pointing out, that we should look at whether there was any selection of sorts. So we have two measures that we can look at. So the cohort size. So if there are miscarriages, for example, selectively in counties with high level of mass shootings, then you will find that the cohort size will shrink in those mass shooting in those counties. And then we have age of mothers. So what if the older mothers, for example, choose not to have children because of mass shootings, because they're more experienced in terms of interpreting these events, but the younger mothers compensate for them in some way, right? And so quickly, I'll show you this one, and we find that there's no change in the cohort size, and there's no change in the average age of the mother. So those are the two measures we have to check for selection, and it seems like there's no selection along those dimensions. Doesn't rule out selection along all others, but to the extent that they're worth, I'm showing you these here. All right, so then what we do is we don't have miscarriages data, because like the data on miscarriages is quite noisy. Not everyone reports a miscarriage, and not even everyone understands one. So what we have is infant mortality rate, and infant mortality rate, as I mentioned before, is at the yearly level. It's not available at the monthly level, so we won't have month fixed effects in there. But we find that in years where there were a high number of fatalities in the county, or there were a high number of mass shooting victims, what you find is there's a higher infant mortality rate in the county. And this is quite meaningful. So an increase in infant mortality rate by 0.009, or I should say 0.01, is quite high. Because US, by the way, has one of the worst infant mortality rates among the developed countries at 6, so this matters even more. So just to show you where the action is coming from, so this is just a density plot of the birth weight by categories in counties where there were no mass shooting incidents and in counties where there were mass shooting incidents. And so what you see is that the mass is being moved from the middle, the good birth weight categories, to the ones that are low birth weight categories, right? So towards the left end. There's also some movement towards the right end, which says that and that too is negative, a negative effect, because birth weight above 4,500 grams is bad. It's associated with later life chances of asthma, diabetes, and some other heart conditions, right? So so that's where most of the action is coming from. Most of them are being driven down the left tail. So they're actually, they have lower birth weight than they would have otherwise had. So
Tushar, sorry, do you have any theories as to why you're getting that bit of clumping on the right there as well?
Yeah, so there is, okay, so I'm not 100% convinced with that theory, but there is medical literature on almost anything you can think of. And one of the things they say is stress, especially during pregnancy, can lead to higher gains in weight for the mother, right? So mother, gains a lot of weight, and the weight gain during pregnancy is directly related to the obesity in later life, to diabetes in later life. So that could be one of the.
Yeah, sure, okay.
So yeah, so that's my best answer, but I'm still not convinced, because the literature doesn't show an increase in birth weight immediately. Increase in birth weight, it shows increase in weight of the child later on in life. So I'm still not convinced, but that's the best I know.
It's very suspicious that you had any babies that were born that light, but I've just Googled it, and there was one born with only 245 grams. So that'll learn me.
The next picture will show you that, okay, so this goes all the way to, I think, 600, but nothing beyond that. But in this picture, I'm starting at 15 or 1400 grams, because we don't have a lot of sample points in categories below that. So what I'm doing in this picture is I'm plotting the change in the cumulative percentage birth in each category. So the first dot here, the one in blue, shows you how many children were born, a percentage of children born between 0 to 9, well, it should be 0 to 1600 grams. The next one does 0 to 1700 grams. The next one does 0 to 1800 grams. So the reason why I'm doing this is, if you suppose see an increase in the percentage of children born in one of these cumulative categories, then that must be because some children have moved from the right tail into that cumulative category, right? So that's what we have here, that a lot of children seem to have moved from high birth categories into the categories that are around the low birth weight cutoff, like the 2500 mark. and some children seem to have gone beyond a particular weight. So all this to say that a lot of the impacts are concentrated in the lower tail of the distribution, that children who were already going to be worse off became even worse, had it even worse because of the mass shootings. All right, so quickly about the mechanisms. Well, as many have conjectured, psychological stress could be a pathway, and the way it works is, women during pregnancy have heightened level of estrogen and progesterone.
Tushar, sorry, you didn't hear me earlier on.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt here? So regarding the previous distribution thing, so when you calculate this accumulated births, I saw you only have the county level data. So when you accumulate, it's just accumulated across counties. You don't have individual weight, right?
No, we have, for every county, we have birth weight by categories. So what is the average birth weight in the categories 0 to 100 grams? What is the average birth in 100 grams to 200 grams?
Okay, so these are the, but and then how how many births within each category within the county?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I see. Right.
So yeah, so why could psychological stress be a pathway? Because during pregnancy, the amount of estrogen and progesterone in a woman's body increases, and that leads to hypervigilant processing of emotional signals of threat. And that's like an evolutionary trait that we have developed. And that can lead to heightened level of anxiety. And I talked about how heightened level of anxiety can have negative effects on the gestation age and on the average birth weight of the child. But one thing that is quite clear, and Michael pointed this out earlier, is that for shooting events which are not in my immediate vicinity, I get to know about them through the media, right? And therefore, if the media coverage of those events increase, there should be a larger impact of mass shootings. And that's in some way reflected in this first table that I showed you, that as the number of fatalities in a mass shooting increase, the media covers it more often, right? And if the media covers it more often, there might be a higher positive impact. So let me show you one picture that kind of makes it clearer. All right, okay. So on the x-axis here, we have deaths, injuries, or victims count in a mass shooting incident, right? So the red one is deaths, blue one is injuries, and green is victims. So that's a total of the two. And on the y-axis, we have the coverage length in percentage terms of the mass shooting events in the ABC evening news. And what you find is as the number of deaths or injuries or victims increase, the coverage increases quite a bit. But obviously, this is endogenous. The coverage is, so this is just the same results in a regression table with a bunch of fixed effects. And you find that as so worse incidents are covered more, right? But then the question is that media coverage is endogenous, so worse incidents will be covered more because they're more newsworthy. But also, if there's a worse incident where a lot of people are killed, then the direct effects would also be higher, right? If a lot of people are killed, then maybe every pregnant woman in the county has some friend or a relative who has died or who has been injured in the incident. So what can we do about that? Well, we'll use something that Michael has used in an earlier paper and some other people have used in the literature. We'll use unexpected international natural disaster related deaths that compete for screen time with mass shooting coverage to create exogenous variation in the amount of coverage of mass shooting incidents, right? So the idea there is that if there are a higher number of international natural disaster related deaths that were exogenous, that were unexpected, around the time of the mass shooting or on the day of the mass shooting, they will compete with the coverage of mass shooting and decrease the coverage that the mass shooting incidents get in media, and therefore should have a weaker impact. So, and just to fix ideas a bit, like, the worst shooting in the Canadian history happened a few days ago. And I don't know how many of you have heard it, but I've been talking to my friends about it. Not many of them heard about it, or at least they don't know the details about it. And one of the reasons why that happened is because of the COVID crisis, that news got buried somewhere, like it didn't get as much attention as it would have otherwise received had the COVID not been there, right? And that's exactly the exogenous, that creates the exogenous variation that we need. So what we will do is basically, so in this table, what I'm showing you is the coverage of mass shooting incidents, how it differs depending on how many disaster-related deaths happen. And so when the number of disaster-related deaths go up, what you find is the coverage of mass shooting incidents go down. Going back to Juan's point earlier, that the coverage of mass shooting incidents in the media are a national level event, right? So it's the same for all counties in the US. So we can't really have county year variation. What we have is just year variation or month variation, so variation across time. So to get around this problem, what we'll do is we'll take our sample, we'll split it by fatalities or mass shooting incidents that happened in around where the number of disaster-related events were less than the median number of disaster-related events in the sample. And the other section will be when the disaster-related events were higher than median. So the idea is that if there are a lot of disaster-related events, so higher than median number of disaster-related events, around the time when there was a mass shooting, there should be no impact because the disaster-related event coverage will reduce the coverage of mass shooting impacts. And that's exactly what we find, that if you look at the impact on average birth weight or gestation or percentage low birth weight, the impact is significant and negative only when there are less number of disaster-related events during pregnancy. So the idea is, mass shooting incidents get more.
Just to interject you here. So I see your point, but isn't this also kind of going against what you're trying to say? Because I see your point that, when there are more disaster-related events that competes with news about mass shootings and et cetera, but then don't disaster-related events also affect stress levels?
Yeah. So that's a good point. That's a very good point. But so one thing that we are doing is we're looking at disasters which are not in the US, which are international, but they will still have a stress impact. We think that impact will be common for all people in the US, will not vary by counties, right? And so to the extent that we still have state year fixed effects in there, it should absorb them.
Okay, so I must have missed this. So how exactly are you slicing this data above and below median? If it's
so we are taking all the events, the births in our counties. We are looking at how many how many disaster-related events, deaths happened during the pregnancy period, right? And then we are slicing it in the middle, right? So these are high disaster-related death pregnancies and low disaster-related death pregnancies. We can do it multiple ways. We have also tried that if there was a disaster on the day of the mass shooting and do the analysis just by that, we find similar results. There's some decrease in significance of low birth weight incidence, but results remain qualitatively similar.
Tushar, sorry, do you have ratings, TV ratings for the county? My intuition?
But we do have it, like in the US, ABC News will have it. I haven't used it yet, but what are you thinking?
My intuition is that a mass shooting in a specific county would change the daily lives of the people living there, and it does affect their TV consuming decisions or habits. And I'm afraid that they're just doing something else rather than watching TV, and maybe that's causing stress because maybe they will be talking to some neighbors or something else about the mass shooting itself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that it also goes back to Simon's point that there are behaviors that mass shooting itself or the news report of mass shootings can trigger, right? I don't want to watch TV. It's nothing good on there, right? But to the extent, so you should see the TV coverage as just a proxy for how much exposure these people have to the mass shooting incidents, right? So it could be that, if suppose we are talking about, right now, the example that I gave you, that the shooting event happened in Canada, and we would have talked about it at work had it not been for COVID, right? COVID is dominating the narrative right now, and that's why it's leading to a reduction in the discussion of other events. It could be on media, it could also be through conversations with people, right? So to the extent that it's a proxy for what the conversation is like,
But I think it's probably worth checking the local habits, because probably it will COVID news would crowd out the news about the shooting for, I don't know, the rest of Canada, but people living in that county are going to be, I don't know, consuming a lot of information about the shooting itself.
Right. No, I agree. And we could look at TV ratings, but so you're saying that we should find that the TV news consumption should go down in those counties where there are more mass shootings and they engage more in conversations with people. Is that the idea?
Definitely. Yes, or you could also use, for example, this paper by the 16 and pregnant paper uses Twitter data.
Yeah.
So they pull Twitter data to check, I don't know, ratings or a proxy for ratings. Maybe you could use something like that.
Yeah. All right. So that's a good idea. We can use Twitter data, and because mass shooting related news is tweeted quite a lot. Yeah, no, for sure. That's a good idea. We can do that. Okay. So moving on, let me show you. Well, sorry, went too far. Yeah. So the results are quite consistent in the sense that when there are a lot of disaster related deaths, and therefore there's a somewhat smaller coverage of or lower coverage of mass shooting incidents. What you find is that the effects are insignificant. When there are less number of disaster-related deaths, the effects are significant and in the right direction. We can do the same thing with infant mortality rate. Again, the effect seems to be coming from the sample where the international natural disaster-related deaths are lower. So that means that implies that the mass shootings will get more coverage. So based on these two, combining these two tables where all these results seem to be consistent with the theory that we have, it seems to us that one of the potential mechanisms is exposure through media reports. We can't rule out the other mechanisms. As Simon was pointing out, there could be some adaptation. This is a reduced form result overall, but we think that the heterogeneity analysis points to the role of media as a pathway. All right, so just to summarize what we find, well, we find that mass shooting incidents in the county during pregnancy decreases average birth weight of all infants in the country, average gestational age of infants in the county increases the percentage of low birth weights, and it hits the left tail the most. The most vulnerable are the ones that are affected the most. We do a bunch of robustness checks, and the results go through. There's no evidence of selection, at least along the two dimensions that I showed you. The change in cohort size or the age of the mother. And we think that there's some suggestive evidence that stress from exposure to these media reports is a likely pathway. We find large effects when the incidents receive more media coverage. So why is this important? What's the economics in it? We showed you that it has long-term implications on their incomes, permanent incomes, and the health of the next generation, so therefore the human capital of multiple generations. But there's some direct policy implications as well. So, I mean, it sheds new light, or it adds to the discussion of the cost of weak gun ownership laws in the US, for example. There's now quite a lot of evidence which shows that weak gun ownership laws are to blame for it, right? There's no way of, skirting that now. And to the extent that, that debate has not taken into account the indirect health costs, it's misinformed, and so the debates should not only acknowledge but also internalize these costs, and perhaps and I think just by doing that, this paper itself will not make them. Anyone who knows about the gun ownership debate and the US knows that it will not make a lot of people change their minds, but to the extent that we can keep adding these pieces of evidence and show that at some point some of them will tip over, and hopefully we'll be able to talk sense into some people. Okay, and so that's one. It informs the debate around gun ownership laws a bit. It adds to the discussion of the cost of these in particular. But there's also some implications about how mass shooting should be reported in the media, and Michael writes really well about this in his paper, that they should be more prudent. Perhaps in Michael's case, it's basically copycat events that happen, and he talks about how not revealing the name, or not making martyrs or heroes out of them can help prevent future events. In this case, it's slightly different and difficult, because when you are covering mass shooting incidents, you want to tell the details. You want to talk about the not so pretty details, because that's what might help people make their minds up or change their minds about gun ownership in particular. So you can't reduce the quality of reporting. You can't reduce the events or the details that you're reporting. But what you could do perhaps is have a discretion, right? So you can have like a disclaimer saying, viewers' discretion advice, and multiple countries, like I know this about India, that we do have disclaimers before such upsetting images come on TV, where they said if you have a heart condition or if you're pregnant or if you're really, really old, perhaps you should exercise discretion. Right, so that could be something that can be done. But these again obviously are weak policy implications. The one that we think is most relevant and is a short-term policy implication is that at least the medical field or the medical practitioners should realize that these events can have psychological effects on their patients, which even the patient might not recognize or might not accept or seek assistance for. The government should realize it too, and therefore they should try even harder to identify and treat these negative psychological events, the effect of these negative psychological events. Okay, negative effect of these negative psychological effects of these events. Got it. All right. So yeah, so that's all I have for you today. If you want me to go through the robustness tables, I can do that for you. But if you have any questions, lay it on me.
Thank you very much, Tushar.
Hi, Tushar.
Yeah.
Okay, Tushar, for your main specification, apart from the fixed effect and fatality, what other variables did you use to control?
Yeah, so in this particular the main specification, we are not using any controls because the county fixed effect will take care of the county level variables and all our outcomes are at the county level. But in one of the robustness checks, so this one, economic and weather control, so what we so I'll show you. So what we include are unemployment rate at the county level, domestic migration, international migration at the county level, temperature fluctuations in the 9 months of pregnancy, and precipitation fluctuations. Yeah.
For example, for these birth outcomes, there's all this prenatal care and other health important measures for the pregnancy. Did you have any control for this?
Yeah, so the downside of using the CDC data is they don't reveal it, all these measures. But we can go back and do the same analysis for data before 2003, where that data, where the information that you're talking about was in the public domain.
Yes.
The only downside is that in that data, there are not a lot of mass shooting incidents. So this is before 2003 I'm talking about, so not a lot of mass shooting incidents. So, but still worth trying. Yeah.
Okay, Tushar, a thought experiment. Suppose you replace this fatality, right?
Yeah.
By, for example, violent crime.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suppose that you're gonna find the same results.
To some extent, yes, but violent crimes can also have, if violent crimes, so depend on what the magnitude of the crime is. If the violent crime is,
well, it can be a homicide. Can be whatever. You choose a bond, but just a thought experiment.
Yeah. So to the extent that you're thinking of homicides and like smaller scale violent crimes, yes, they will have the same effect. And I think that's where, so that's one of the arguments that we are making, that it's not something special about the mass shooting incidents in particular, but like stressful events during pregnancy can have these long-term implications on health. If they are large-scale violent events like riots and like wars.
But you see, you see that the flavor of your message will gonna change.
Yeah. So
it's not necessarily for the gun control, but the message is much more broad.
Yeah. No, I agree.
More, so I do not know to where you would like to.
Yeah. Right now we have both of them as contributions, right? So violent crimes, events in early life, and also the economics of mass shooting. But you're correct. Depending on how we want to tell the story, perhaps the narration.
And also, this also has this idea of this coverage. It's not necessarily coverage of mass shooting. Coverage.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, so hopefully, so that's what we're trying to do right now. Hopefully, with the future iterations of the draft, we can come up with the cohesive that we want.
But anyway, I think right. There's this just for my personal taste, is the following. I mean, if you have some more about health information at the county level, for example, how the mothers are being treated, prenatal care, health insurance coverage, things like this.
Yeah.
There was this Obamacare on the way. Things like this that also impacts the output of your variables, and this would I think your message would be much more strong.
Yeah, no, we can definitely do that. I mean, obviously, some of these variables that you mentioned are changing over time. So, yes, they will not be absorbed.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I may,
yeah.
Tusha.
Yeah.
So this is related to Leandro's comments. So far you have discussed a lot about this mechanism operating through media exposure.
Yeah.
And then we went the very long lens to kind of check that mechanism.
Yeah.
And it feels to me that there's no alternative mechanism in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But I would encourage you to think more about other alternative pathways.
Yeah.
For example, I can, it may sound, I just make up this story, all right? So for example, if there's a mass shooting happening in my county and I'm a pregnant woman,
mm-hmm.
and suddenly I feel it's no longer safe to go outside.
Yeah.
Is it possible that can actually reduce my, prenatal checkup?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I miss a couple of prenatal checkups, and then that had a direct impact on my baby.
Right.
Or suppose I'm working in a restaurant,
mm-hmm.
right? But because the mass shooting and people feel it's no longer safe to go out and have food,
mm-hmm.
so that reduces my income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that might also have an impact on my baby.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can think of alternative mechanisms.
True.
But I don't know how much you can actually go that far to test these alternatives. But I just feel like so far you spend a lot on this media mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it probably was thinking about something else as well.
True.
If there's only one mechanism, then that's just too simple.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's one of the things that we do in the summary of the paper and here as well, that we say that stress through exposure to media is a likely pathway. We're not saying it's the only pathway, right? And we are very careful about it in the discussion. But going back to the two examples that you gave, they somehow rely on the people getting to know about mass shootings, right? So you use the term fear twice or thrice in your example, and that is a psychological pathway. Yes, fear might lead to behaviors like I won't go out and eat, but fear is a key component of that, right? And so that's where we are thinking that that's where the psychological angle comes in. But yes, I mean, to the extent that there could be multiple pathways, we're trying to be very careful in how we tell the story.
So one quick comment.
Yeah.
Tusha. So if you're really convinced about this a media story, and I think that could be a big considerable spillover across county boundaries. So for your right-hand side variable, can you just construct the fatality by aggregating of this, or the fatality for the whole United States, weighted by the inverse of the distance to the county?
Yeah, so we have done that. So one of the robust,
Okay.
So this robustness check, for example, I don't know where I have. I've shown it to you for 25-kilometer radius, just taking that and weighing them by distance. But we have done 100, 200, 500, right? So we can also do the entire United States, right? So that might be, and that's a good idea. We can do that for the entire United States. Yeah.
Okay. So another comment is because. Can I still?
Sorry, just real quick on that one. What you're doing is you're just defining a binary variable of treatment area. But I think what Sean was referring to is that it might be continuous.
Yes.
By distance.
So we are not defining it as a binary variable. What we are doing is we're taking the fatalities and then we are weighing that fatality number by how the inverse of how far the center of the county is from the shooting coordinates. Right, so.
Yes, another observation from your data is that because there are so many zero observations, as Yanru has already pointed out.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering there could be some actually non-linear effect from the effect could change could be different from zero mass shooting to 1 mass shooting, and from 1 to 2, the effect will be quite non-linear. So can you just first very simply to divide all the observations into 2 groups? Okay. No mass shooting at all, and there is mass shooting, and then the second specification could just interact this dummy variable with the number of fatalities. This can disentangle this nonlinear effect. And another advantage of doing so is now you can just take the log of the fatalities once you do that, right? Because now you just mix the 0 and non-zero, you cannot take the log. But with that specification, by interaction, you can take the log of the fatalities.
Yeah.
The reason by doing the log, because I found that in your observation of fatalities, actually there are some observations very big fatalities, but very few observations actually.
Yeah, true.
That means the distribution just skewed to the left.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, by taking the log, it could be quite become very close to normal distribution or something like that.
True, true. I mean, so one thing we have done is we have done the analysis by like Vincering and like, you know, trimming off the boundaries. Like, you know, if there are more than 20 fatalities, we don't include them. Results don't change much, but I agree that, you know, to get to what Andre was also pointing out and like, you know, the non-linear effects, perhaps an interaction with the fatalities is a better way to go. Yeah, I can do that. Thank you.
Tushar?
Yeah.
I have a couple questions. One is, have you seen this paper by Emily Olsen in which she looks at selection based on observables?
Yeah.
Maybe it would be a good idea to run your main specification by.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we could do that. How much the selection on the unobservables has to be able to create that effect, right? Yeah, we could do
exactly.
That. Yeah.
And on the same line, maybe it would be a nice idea just to build up your regression, because we have no idea how the fixed effects are contributing to the overall effect.
So one is one to start with, and then go on adding effects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
maybe.
one thing. And the other.
Yep. Yeah. Go for it.
Go on. Oh, no, I'll go for it.
No. All yours.
Okay. So the other thing that I was thinking is that maybe natural disasters are stressful on itself, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how it may play out, but I'm just concerned about it. That maybe they are crowding out the news about the shooting, but they might be stressful themselves.
Right.
And I don't know how they might.
Yeah. So two things about that, right? Basically, if they are stressful, I mean, there's no reason to believe that they'll be more stressful in regions with mass shooting incident, unless you believe that, you know, there's a complementarity between stress of different types, which you can. But even in that case, what you should find happening is when there are more natural disaster deaths in a county with mass shooting events, the effect is, you know, even higher, right? What we find is the opposite, right? So to the extent that, you know, that sign tells you something about how they're, you know, interpreting the incident, we should be all right.
Yeah, fair enough. And the other one is about the graphs you were showing at the very beginning. Maybe instead of just plotting the scatter, maybe you could just go ahead and do something that Michael's does, is that put the means, like when there's no mass shooting and when there's mass shooting, and then that will give you like a sense of the overall change.
Yeah, we could do that, definitely. A coef plot of some sort. Yeah,
yep.
Definitely. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, if there is one.
Tushar, has anyone looked at the duration of the sort of mass shootings in terms of looking at heterogeneous effects as to whether those mass shootings are, you know, prolonged over days, or I mean whether there's enough variation to look at that? Because I think of a massacre in Tasmania in Australia in Port Arthur that went on for 2 days. 35 people were killed, and it was just horrific. And that actually led to a change in gun laws in Australia. But I don't know if you can look at whether you have, you know, a lot of variation in the data as far as the mass shootings, whether you could do that.
Yeah, so there are some that go, like, so the recent one in Canada, I mean, it's not my sample, but that went for 2 days, right? Like more than 12 hours actually. So, and yes, I mean, there's my conjecture would be that they will have a much worse impact because people are scared for their lives. unfortunately, what you pointed out, that we don't have enough of those incidents in our sample to say something conclusively about it.
All right, so I think let's call it a presentation from here on. Obviously, exchange any thoughts, comments you have over email, over Zoom, any sort of mechanisms you like. Thank you very much, Tushar. Very interesting talk. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you.